Hi, my name is Braxton Montier. I'm with UFLTV, and I'm here interviewing Dwight Hurst. Dwight, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Hello. Thanks for having me. Actually, I really
Of
appreciate
course.
it. My name is Dwight. I am a psychotherapist. I work with, well, lots of different presenting issues, but I do work with family and relationships and things quite a bit. Has been a big part of my career. And I do public education and things through podcasting as well. And I'm the creator and host of the Broken Brain podcast that is out there as well, talking about all kinds of things mentally healthy. So I'm excited to be able to talk to you today.
Wonderful. Well, I do have a couple of questions for you. So let's dig into that. Um, so when people go through a divorce, it's usually the first time they've ever had to deal with anything in this kind of sphere of law. Some people might have traffic tickets, they're not going to really interact in a meaningful way. And so they really only hear terms kind of thrown around. So a term that they often hear is parental alienation that comes up a lot in child custody disputes. Is there a formal definition that mental health professionals use?
Well, there are terms, yes, there are ways to kind of break that down. It's always important to differentiate a little bit between the legal terminology, which, establishing or proving something in a court. That's one place where therapists have to be, I think, very clear when they are talking to people. We might say, well, this sounds like abuse or this sounds like alienation if it comes up. So, but we have to be careful that it's not like, oh, good, you're willing to go and swear on a stack of Bibles that that's what it is legally. So we have to differentiate, I think, there too. From a clinical perspective, what we're seeing is there's two terms: alienation. When we're talking about alienation, there's alienating and there's alienated, and the difference being alienating is an action that a parent will take to try to push the child away from the other parent. And there's various motivations that you see for that, uh, ranging from anxiety to malice, obviously. And then
Yeah.
alienated is what we might call a child who essentially, what we usually look for there is if the child is overtly talking about anger and things, or if the vicinity of a parent is triggering and triggers relationship issues and stress issues in the child, then we would say they're alienated. They don't always co-occur, but we often think of these as occurring, together. If someone is alienated, it could just be because of a tricky relationship. It could also be because of the trauma of the situation of the divorce, and then often it can be uh, uh, obviously the other person alienating. And so trying to differentiate and work those things out is a big part of the communication and processing that you might do in therapy.
Wonderful. So you talked a little bit about this. How do you determine that parental alienation is occurring in a custody dispute? What are the kind of hallmarks that you look for?
Mm-hmm. There's a couple different components. I always like to start out, having worked with a lot of court ordered situations over the years. It's important for people to realize that your counselor is most likely going to believe you mostly when you come in. Um, with There's some qualifiers here I'll add, but
Yeah.
first of all, if someone comes in and says, "Well, my ex is doing this," or my soon-to-be ex, whatever, if other parent is doing this, it's not really a counselor's job to play detective and say, "Are they really?" Um, Once again, with a little qualifier, that's also why the courts don't regard an individual counselor as an evaluator or an expert of making a huge recommendation, because we just don't have that capacity of our relationship with the client. Now, there are a couple qualifiers.
Yeah.
One of those is collateral information. Oftentimes with the court, you may have a court report, a court order. Those things are often supplied by the client. As a counselor, I don't have a power to compel the client to do anything, but I might ask to see it, if they're willing to give it to me. If they're not, that's kind of weird, to be honest. But
Yeah.
the other part that you're looking for is sort of going back to the idea of sorting out what's really going on. If someone presents in session as acting very paranoid, if they interpret everything that other parent does as alienation, then that may become a clinical goal, a treatment goal, to talk about where's your level of sensitivity? Do you bring anything to the table? Do you not? And that would mostly form from the discussion. But the sort of default position is you come see me, you tell me what you're here for, I'll believe you, and then we'll work on your perceptions as part of the therapy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. And until you get like, maybe you talk to the other person or you talk to the kids and they're like, well, that's actually not really happening, or that's not exactly how it went down. And then you kind of play a little bit of, uh, like you said about the perception. Somebody may just be interpreting everything as alienation. They might just
It
be
certainly
really
can.
sensitive to it.
And there are cases where I've had, if I work with a parent, for example, and they're telling me, or if the collateral court information indicates that this is the case, that, maybe there's something that happened, or if there's a question of whether or not something happened. It's been investigated, it's been adjudicated. It isn't helping, it isn't being discussed in the court anymore. Those kinds of things. Then, once again, an area of focus would be, sure, you have to process your own emotions, but why are we still, are we still bringing it up? Are we still hung up on it? Is there anxiety? Is there anger? And with children who come in, basically, this also goes back to the court reporting. If a child tells us, a custody evaluator or a therapist, something, we can only report that they said this. And I have had clients over the years who told me my parent hit me, and they'll ask some questions. And I've been asked to write a letter by an attorney as would you make a statement that the child told you this? And of course, then there's mandatory reporting for the state. And now a
Yeah,
state investigator is going to be different than someone like me who can only say, on this date, this child told me this, and take that for what it's worth, right?
yeah,
So yeah, you're really, there's a line there between believing the client and trying to act like I'm not a detective. Also, that's why, once again, the court doesn't want my testimony that this is a good parent and the other parent sucks, because I may have never even met the other parent. And even if I did, I don't know that. Right. So I'm not going to try to report on those things. I'm going to just try to help the person with what they're working through.
yeah. So you also hear the term estrangement. I know we talked about that a little bit, parental estrangement. What is the difference between parental alienation and parental estrangement? Because I
Yeah.
know we talked about the difference between alienation and alienated,
Right.
but yeah,
Yeah. Well, in estrangement, I will say, it's probably one of these cases where, not every estrangement is because of alienation, but successful alienation, I guess you could call it successful, um,
yeah,
does generally trigger estrangement. So, but estrangement is a good thing to kind of evaluate when you are looking at the it would be similar to the alienated in a way, but when you're looking at a child and a parent who are estranged, meaning that, and typically speaking, it's not a strict definition, but it usually means it's almost not even talking, right?
yeah,
And you see this pervasive in adulthood, even this will go forward. But when you have that, you're kind of looking at why, right? And that's where a client might be asked, a parent might be asked to look into insight. And one of the great tricky things about these situations is it's usually pretty rare that there is 100% cut and dried. There are lots of different things that co-occur. If my child isn't talking to me, it's probably healthy for me, is definitely healthy for me to evaluate all of the possible reasons why. My own behavior, is there that alienation factor? Is the situation just such that, that type of a thing? And I will say one thing that kind of bonds these together that we don't think of. So if someone comes in and says, my child and I are estranged, right? We are automatically focused on that relationship. When someone comes in and says, my other parent X is alienating my child, the trap we can fall into is dealing only with that relationship, me and my other parent, right?
yeah,
Um, and the most important thing in cases of alienation is the relationship between parent and child. And I'll give you an example. There are times where someone might be attempting parent alienation and it isn't working. Now, does the person have the right, and should they respond to that in whatever mechanism, whether it's through lawyers or whatever, through the court? Yeah, sure. But the sort of goal is for me to have a good relationship with my child, right? And if they're not actually alienated, then what am I doing with the kid? That's actually like if we're working together, that shouldn't affect my I shouldn't really be talking about that or worried about it with the kid because we're cool, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Um, so how often do you see this happening? How often do you see alienation actually occurring?
Well, it's funny because as counselors, we always have a little bit of a biased sample because, that's why people call us
Yeah,
up, especially if they read me on the FCC list or whatever, if they're told, to come see someone like me. So, but I will say, so even with my experience, the majority of clients I work with who are going through divorces, most of them that's not happening. I did look up, it's a difficult thing for there to be true research here because of the levels, right, of it. Most therapists, when they're surveyed, seem to say that they don't see 100% malicious alienation very frequently. There is some estimation that somewhere, or one thing I read said 13.4%, which is pretty exact. Another one said that that there are 20 to 25% of parents going through divorce who, within the first 6 years, uh, commit some type of alienating behaviors. Now, that's also a very broad range, right, as well.
yeah,
So, and ages 8 to 14 also, that was another thing, are the highest at risk to actually be alienated from their parent and to be susceptible to manipulation as well. I think one thing that's important is, do we look at when we look at things we can control, are we ever committing alienation type of act and alienating type of actions without meaning to? So on the really bottom of the scale, it might even be, do I go too much when talking about other parent, right?
yeah,
Or do they overhear one parent on the phone to a good friend saying something negative, or just things like that? Now that also occurs when partners are still married too. So it's nobody's perfect, but it is good to kind of look at that as well because that can also bounce back and make damage the relationship between them and their child as well.
yeah. So, how do you deal with parental alienation and estrangement in therapy? Um, is it something that the whole family participates in? Do you do it on like an individual level?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, and that's an excellent question. It's one of these things where it's essentially there's a lot of different flavors of situations that you have
yeah,
coming in, right? And it kind of depends, number one, what the court may ask for. And then you have a lot of people who come in looking for help with this who doesn't nothing's happened in court. It's just that they pick up on it that it's happening. So
yeah,
um, you have some people who the reason they present determines kind of what is probably going to happen. Some people are given a requirement for individualized training in the area of stop alienating, or coming in to deal with the stress of their partner alienating and kind of trying to brainstorm what to do about that. And that would be one on one with the parent, right? Those would be the most common situations for that. Um, then you also have sometimes where people are being either compelled or they recognize a problem and they come in to do some kind of co parenting therapy. Now, that one actually almost all the time is the two of them coming in together, almost like couples counseling. And in fact, I often recommend, and I know a lot of people who are going through couples counseling at the time they decide to divorce. And it's a good idea, if it's at all possible and if it's not too high conflict, to continue with that to sort of proactively prep for as healthy as possible co parenting and separation. So you can do that. That's something I do recommend for people if they are able to do it. But there are times where people are so high conflict they can't come in together to work on co-parenting. Then you might work with either two or one therapist coordinating that with them individually and hopefully moving towards meeting together. Then of course you've got the kids. Let's throw the kids into the mix here.
yeah,
You still have individual where the kids may come in and say, how come you don't want to talk to your parent, kind of a thing. That's kind of the most casual version. And then
yeah,
you might have all the way up to where the court is saying reconciliation therapy is being required, sort of a thing between this parent and this child. That's tricky. Usually you have to really take that as it comes. It often is not, it does not feel safe for a young, particularly a child or early teen child, especially, to sit in the room from day one with the parent who they are alienated from and have the therapist tell them, get along, let's talk about it. Talk openly about why you feel
Yeah.
alienated with them sitting here while you're alienated from them, right? Um,
Yeah, that would be really hard, I would
yeah.
imagine.
Yeah, and often counterproductive. I think it's good to have some individual sessions with the child, individual sessions with the parent, and that can be and often is with the same therapist within the goal of having some joint sessions together. Um, One of the things that's very important is giving the child power in the situation. Children often don't have power, right? Um,
Yeah.
and that's hard because they may come in saying things that they've been told that may or may not be true by the other, the alienating parent. um, and so that is difficult for them to process through that. But you're not there to tell them that's not true, stop it, you should, it's more looking at, well, what would it take and what do you need in order to feel like this is safe. Another thing with therapy is always, we always have to be cautious not to be predictive or forceful even of the outcomes, because there are times where someone may not want to reconcile with a parent because of something that's been done that's abusive. Now, what's not exactly what we're talking about today, because we're talking about purposeful alienation mostly.
Yeah.
Um, but you can actually use kind of the same model for the parent who's coming in. This is very hard, especially if you are innocent of the things that are being said, or the other parent is maliciously trying to use the child to hurt you.
Yeah.
Very difficult to be humble, but sometimes you got to be willing to sit and listen to something and say, I'm sorry. So I did. So finding something you can identify with, that you can honestly say, I'm sorry. You don't want to say, I'm sorry I robbed all those banks if you didn't rob all those banks. Just an example,
Yeah.
silly example. Um, you don't have to do that. But if the therapist is helping and it's like, well, what is it about robbing the banks that makes you upset? Well, I feel like you don't care about me as much as you did about all those banks. Then we're talking about, well, yeah, wow, I'm sorry that uh, you you don't feel like I'm putting you first. That must be awful. You know, I'm sorry for times that I haven't put you first, because can't we all find something in there to, if we can find something to empathize with and to tell the child, well, I'm legitimately sorry um, that that's happening right in your life, that must really hurt. That's a start. And that, boy, that takes a little bit of work to get to the point. That's not a day one session, right?
Yeah. And so to piggyback off of that, um, what does it take for therapy to be successful? We talked about some therapy being court ordered. Some people come in of their own free will. Um, I imagine that kind of the honesty that you're talking about finding the genuine connection between the two people, and that can't be very easy to do, especially if you've been court ordered to do so.
Yes. Well, oftentimes the successful outcome really is, it's necessary to hone in the focus on the relationship with the child or the relationship with the parent, right? The relationship between those two. One of the great difficulties if you're going through a divorce is you've got to know which project you're working on. A divorce is both a practical legal process and a huge emotional, healing therapeutic project that you're going through. You want to be very careful not to confuse one with the other. If you're looking for emotional satisfaction and a sense of justice, or even worse, vengeance, through the
Yeah.
practical handling the project, which often people do, you're going to be disappointed. It's not going to make you, even if you win, you usually don't feel better just because of that, right? Um,
Yeah, a lot of people feel that it's a Pyrrhic victory to win at divorce. You know,
yes.
yeah, I finally got the divorce order that I wanted, but
Hmm.
I'm now $100,000 in debt. It has been
Right.
10 years. I've won at what cost? Really,
And I'm
really did I win? Yeah.
yeah, and I'm still hurt and angry, you
Oh
know.
yeah.
I think that one of the things, and this is, I don't mean, tell me if this is too tangential, but one of the things that I think can be damaging is our usual interpretation or definition of the idea of closure. Um, Closure is something that we believe we have to get from another person. I will have closure when you decide to tell me I'm right or to apologize to me or make amends to me or something, or at least hear me out. The problem with that is you don't have to do that, especially if you
No.
think you're right, which most of us do. Um, and so closure is actually a therapeutic process. This is in the emotional project management. Um, and the reason I kind of go there when it comes to parent-child relationships is it is very important for the parent to focus on the emotional success with their child looks like a good relationship with their child. It doesn't look like my child finally understands that I'm not guilty. They need to see that the other parent is guilty and that they were lying to them, and they need to know that, and or else that's the goal, right? It's like, well, no, the goal is to get along. and
Yeah.
and if the child thinks, hey, I won because you apologized to me, or to a certain extent, it's also a big obstacle if we get caught thinking, if the other parent thinks they won, I've lost. But that has nothing to do with it. They can go, one of the, I'm going to say, benefits, or one of the elements of divorce as a solution to a problem is that we don't have to fight that anymore. They can go think that, I can go think this. We don't have to fight like that anymore. And
Yeah.
why would we, right? Let's not keep doing that fight if we can help it, right?
Yeah.
No.
So, another big part of divorce that can come up is a custody evaluation. How does parental alienation and estrangement kind of factor into that custody evaluation? Do you have a lot of
Right.
experience with them? Yeah.
Well, I do, as I will say, I'm not a custody evaluator, but I've worked with, and I will say more like been interviewed by a lot of them. So and in fact, if I had a client that was going through a custody evaluation, if I never heard from the custody evaluator, that would be unusual, let's say, and probably not great ethics. So when you have a custody evaluator, let me preface this too. Um, every custody evaluator, especially if they have like online reviews or something, they're gonna disappoint someone usually, right?
Yeah.
Either one or both parties will usually be disappointed. If you get to a point where you're having custody evaluated, things aren't going well. And
Yeah. Yeah.
if they come in and favor one parent, the other one's going to be pissed off or angry. If they favor, vice versa. Or if they come in fairly neutral, often both of them are annoyed because it's not a cheap process. It's usually split
No.
cost between the two, right? I
Yeah,
mean, you
but then
see
it's
this.
still like, 7, 8 grand usually.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so what you're looking for, so basically, I guess what I'm trying to say is just anticipate someone's going to be. And so a lot of people, you have no shortage of people out there who are like, custody evaluators are bullshit. They're terrible and they pick sides and everything. Um, some do. I will just say my experience has been that generally speaking, when I have talked to them, their attempt and the ethics of custody evaluation is to be like you're looking at just the facts. Whatever I can establish is what I'll put in. Now that fact might be this, I observably saw this, I guess. More often what you're saying, the facts are this person said this, this other person confirmed or also said it. In other words, I read a police report that said it happened, right?
Yeah.
So you're kind of doing that. The tricky part is, as counselors, they have to kind of then shift to a evaluator slash detective, I guess you could say. Some counselors don't do it well because we're trained, and our nature is usually to be emotive, right? We're led by emotions, and we
Yeah.
want to protect the kids. But the evaluator, that's not, their job is secondarily, I guess, to protect the kids from if they can tell that there's a bad situation. Um, but a lot of times, the outcome of that is, people, they'll come in and say, okay, everybody in a high conflict situation is going to say the other person's terrible, the other person's a narcissist, the other person's an abuser, the other person's whatever. Um, And so you go in and you kind of evaluate, and often they find it's like, well, yeah, they did some bad things. Are they a clinical narcissist? Well, they've been through these testings, psychological. There's no evidence of that, but they've been accused of it. Um, and I guess I don't want to get too far afield of your question. Where am I at in relation to answering your question?
No, I think that's very good. I think you're perfectly within scope. Let's circle back on a lot of people do believe that they're pseudoscientific. You'll hear lawyers argue for and against it. Some judges really like it, some don't. Um, how easy is it to fool the custody evaluator? Because
I
you
mean,
you probably get people who are trying to lie to you all the time.
sure.
Yeah,
Oh yeah, and you get, I will say, I mean, therapists get this. That's one of the reasons why we don't write evaluations. As I said before, if you have a therapist who's willing to write one, they probably don't know the process very well, and haven't thought it through very well.
yeah,
This happens also with DCFS. I've worked with Child and Family Services over the years, and they'll get calls where people are making allegations, and sometimes people might do that in order to win points, with an evaluator. Because look, I filed 16 cases, which, so, I mean, you have some of those kind of situations that, well, I think that, that could work, but also it can come across as kind of overkill and sort of spurious in nature. And as human beings, not all, most people who are somewhat healthy psychologically, they don't lie well. We don't. It's usually not consistent with reality, and it's usually easy to see through. And we usually do it when we're anxious and under duress, or we want something very badly. And so, a lot of that comes out. I think the better that a custody evaluator is at sticking to the observable, what they can report, the more they're not necessarily going to be fooled because they're not trying to make it. Now, that being said, the more extreme personality, either personality disordered or just unhealthy individuals who are narcissistic or manipulative, they oftentimes can be quite successful because they are consistent, and they might do research and they might do things like that. I do know also, if people aren't aware, and I'm not going to endorse or not endorse this, I'm interested if you've come across this. There are people who are custody evaluators that will sometimes be hired individually by a parent who is prepping for a custody evaluation. An attorney will reach out to them, and they'll sit down and sort of coach them on how to theoretically, they're coaching them on how to present themselves as honestly as possible, but I don't know that there's any way to completely separate the idea that they're working for the person to help them win. You know what I mean? I don't know if you've seen this happen.
I've never really seen a custody evaluator, come in before the divorce is even started. Usually, from the ones that I've seen, I have very little experience as a legal assistant, but from the custody evaluations that we have seen kind of come in through the cases that we've been on, it's usually done, the court orders it. One person has moved for this. Um, and then, we're usually against them. But
Mm.
yeah, we
One of
don't
the,
find a lot of people
yeah.
try to get in ahead of the curve.
Oh
But
yeah, no, it's usually once it's been ordered, and if someone has the
yeah,
money to do that, and sometimes it might be someone who doesn't do it anymore. I don't know. I've
yeah,
really,
they can reach out and kind of talk to people, kind of see what's going
yeah,
on. But the
yeah.
other
Well,
half of that
exactly.
coin, the gamesmanship of, I'm trying to get under the umbrella of I'm trying to get you to be as honest as possible. Really, I'm kind of telling you how you should say stuff. I
Right.
mean,
Exactly.
lawyers have a reputation for being terrible for a reason.
Well, and it's also, this is one of the negatives, a couple of the negatives of the custody evaluation process is that you are working with someone, as I said before, who's not a trained detective, generally speaking. They're
Yeah,
usually trained. Now, they might have a background in child abuse investigations sometimes,
yeah,
um, you know, but still, they're essentially a social worker or counselor by background, usually, unless somebody out there has some statistics that I'm not aware of, but that's all the ones I've ever met have that was their background. Um, there are a couple of natural incentives that enter into the dynamic, which is that are not conducive to the truth. For example, the parents. you have no incentive to tell them anything. There's no natural incentive to tell them anything that will damage your case that you are the one who should get most custody or not be denied custody. There just isn't. I mean, maybe internal morality guidelines, sure. If you want to, if you're an honest person, that's important to you. But it's about your kid. I mean, we take a bullet for our kid. Would we not hide a thing that we don't think matters? So there's an incentive there. I also know, I have known many counselors, and this is one I'm kind of hesitant to say this. You decide if you want to keep it in. No, I'm the only hesitancy I have saying this is I don't want people to go in thinking that this is going to mean more than it should. But people I know who have been counselors who have been looking into doing custody evaluations, one of the reasons why is it is lucrative. If you're doing it and you get in with the
Yeah.
courts, as you put, thousands of dollars, you don't ever, once it's over, I mean, people have to sign a thing that says they, aren't going to stalk you or something like that. It's not that they
Yeah.
can't, but oftentimes they will require that post contact is severely limited. You're not supposed to call the evaluator again. And if you do, often they'll even say go through your attorney. Um, and also, many people don't know this, but every case I've been aware of, you as a parent do not get a copy. The evaluation goes to
No,
the court.
that's
And
usually costs extra.
exactly, you can request a copy, but it's usually, let's say, I think the goal with the fee is that it's prohibitively expensive for most people. Most people are not going to
Mhm.
do it. The
Yeah.
reason for that, I mean, it makes sense because you don't want to be like, oh, here's where I'm going to go ahead and nitpick everything and I'm going to deny. I know what to deny now that did happen. But then on the other hand, as an individual, if it's your child and it's your rights, don't we usually have the right to, say, no, the custody evaluator isn't perfect. If it's like, hey, they said that my therapist said this and my therapist will be willing to sign a thing saying they didn't say this, shouldn't you have the right to do that? I don't know. So there's the downsides too. Anytime we have people
Yeah.
involved in a process, it gets complicated.
Yes, it does. So let's jump to my next question. That wonderful kind of area for discussion. Do you ever get the impression that the courts are kind of dumping problems with family dysfunction onto therapists? They're like, there's obviously a problem here. Something in the machine isn't working. I don't know what it is, so I'm just gonna kind of make it someone else's problem.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to say that I think the answer to that is a yes, but kind of answer.
Okay.
I think by definition, they probably always are. It's then the but is that bad? Right.
Yeah.
Um, and it depends. I have seen where, of course, I never know the intention, but there are cases where essentially I get the idea that the court, the judge, the whoever, the special master, whoever it is that's calling the shots, basically says, go do this and shut up. Sort of. It's like, I don't want to, we don't want
Yeah.
to, we can't adjudicate this in here anymore. You go get therapy about it, bring back a report that says you did it and you participated in therapy. And that's really all we need is to check a box. You get that
Yeah.
sometimes, right?
They
And
so we also have a similar process for mediation where you are required to go to mediation, but sometimes people don't go in good faith. You're required to go in good faith to actually try to sort it out. But a lot of people sometimes just don't. They'll go there, they'll just waste time. They'll just, oh, I don't really intend to settle, but I'll sit here and, you know, make them believe that I tried. So,
mhm.
I mean, sometimes you get that.
And there are also times where people will, like an attorney, from what I can
Hmm.
tell, and even what clients will tell me anyway, that their attorney will say, let's just do this because it's something we can do. It's not harmful. You can go get this, even if you think you don't need it. And then we'll
Yeah.
that's like an acquiescence we can offer in negotiations and compromise. And they're not always one or the other, though. It's like, it doesn't, just because someone is like being pushed into therapy that it's like questionable, it doesn't mean they won't benefit from it. And it doesn't mean that they shouldn't do it anyway. I will say, it ranges from being like, we need to check a box, in which case, is it just to placate someone or whatever? It's not, probably the most like medically determined necessary thing.
Yeah.
And I have known people, by the way, who through the process of maybe their divorce or whatever, or the other party knows that they've been
Mhm.
diagnosed with something and it's never really been a problem, but it's like, well, you've been diagnosed with this within the last couple of years, bipolar or autism or something, and so therefore you automatically need to get evaluated by a therapist to be a parent. And that to me, it can be, unless there's other attending problems that tie back to that, um, or evidence that they can't manage or haven't managed it well, basically a form of discrimination. If you hold that over someone's head just because they have a medical condition, I mean, if you said you have a heart condition, I'm afraid you might have a heart attack while the kids are over there, unless you can prove the person is not taking medication and they've had heart attacks in front of the kids 16 times or something. Um, that's a lot of heart attacks, by the way. I'm not a
Oh, yeah. I
cardiologist,
mean,
but it's you wouldn't that wouldn't fly, right? And so
yeah.
there's a big
Why?
broad umbrella.
Yeah. Why is the presumption not that both people are equally fit until determined not so? You know, it's like, no, no, we're going to act under the presumption that each person is a capable parent. I mean, they raised the children together up until now. Now they're getting divorced. Why are they, why are we not just assuming that they're both equally qualified to be parents? You know,
And
we
this,
can later
yes,
determine that, oh, because, this person's medical condition, there's it's some sort of pertinent condition that, really loud noises set this person off in a way,
right.
something that would actually prohibit them from having the children, a completely equal time,
Right,
you know.
exactly. And that gets into, once again, that emotional versus practical.
Yeah.
And I think this is important, probably for therapists to know too, is that when we report, we're reporting, here's what I see in session. Usually emotional progress is what I can tell, is this is what's observable. If we have an outlet for collateral information, if we know of drug testing results, or we have, we might report this person seems to be going through this and there's this collateral information. But from the court perspective, we're looking at hopefully, and a lawyer, I assume, you tell me, it seems like you're looking more at like observable behavioral issues. It's like, well, my ex or soon to be ex is bipolar. So therefore, they're a problem. And it's like, well, is there any evidence? Do they get manic and they go off their medication and they go, I don't know, do some really reckless, impulsive behavior and, go to Vegas one night and the kids are alone or something or whatever. I feel like I can say this okay for anyone out there. I have bipolar disorder, so I can, anyway, I don't mean to poke at it. Um, but on the other hand, it's like, are they like medicated and they've been well and they haven't had any real symptoms for, maybe no serious symptoms ever or for a period of years and stuff? There's no reason, like, what's the reason here? So you're kind of like balancing once again, knowing who to go to for that, the emotional versus the practical.
Yeah. So my next question is, do you ever get the idea that parents are trying to kind of game the system and use mental health professionals as weapons against each other? Like, you know, we'll go in there, I'll pretend to be really, really good, and then really disparage you just to kind of throw you in contrast or make myself, make you seem crazy because I seem like such a good guy, or,
Mhm.
something like that.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. I will say I don't think that that's the majority. I don't believe that it's the majority, but it does happen. There are all sorts of examples. I mean, society where people try to use therapy as a way to get out of accountability for something, and in this case, maybe to set themselves up to look good. Um, and and once again, here's a fine line. There's the but. Is it always bad if I have done things that have alienated my kid? I probably should get some therapy, and that is relevant for my attorney to share, right? Oh, I've been in therapy for a year and a half or something. Then it's like, well, that probably is relevant actually in real life. Now if I'm only doing it so that I look good, then I guess from a certain perspective, can someone win as far as getting a little chip in their favor? Yes, I think that that is stymied to a certain amount by the therapist knowing their own boundaries. If the therapist is going to say, hey, they're great, they've really been maligned, don't say that. because you don't know if they're great and you don't know if they've been maligned. Say they've come in and reported this, we're working on these goals, they participated in therapy. I mean, all of those things. And oftentimes, even, therapists will often consult with the attorney to say, what specifically, not what you want me to say, but what should I highlight? What is it that I'm supposed to report on? Well, did the person show up? Yeah, they showed up. Did they,
Were they
whatever.
actively participating? Were they just sitting
Exactly.
in the corner playing on their phone? Yeah,
Right.
that would be pretty important.
Yeah. And that's really all you can say. And so, one of the ways that you can kind of tell, and that where a therapist might appropriately push back, would be if you make it clear, as most of us do, I am not going to make custody recommendations. More often than manipulative, malicious behavior, I do see people who think maybe if I have a therapist for my child or myself or both, then I can kind of get a cheap custody evaluation. Like I can, get the benefits of one without spending 5, 10 grand. And I think it's good to upfront tell people that's not going to happen. I'm never going to make a custody recommendation. And then if it comes up a bunch after that and there's pushing on that boundary, then that becomes something that the therapist is probably going to talk to the person about and say, why do you keep coming back with this? I can't do that. Um, and that kind of can stymie if you know your role, if you know your place. I will say I've seen people fall into this. I worked in community mental health, and one time I wasn't involved in this decision and didn't know the person particularly well, but there was a therapist who was actually fired because it was a court ordered substance abuse program, and they went to a child and family services or evaluation hearing of some kind, and actually took the stand and just laid into, essentially, when you look at it objectively, laid into a bunch of people they didn't know, the DCFS worker, the other
Yeah.
parent, and said, look at this. And because we care about our clients, we want the best for them. It's terrible to see them going through things, especially if they're being maligned or pushed around. Now, in this case, this person was loaded for bear and ready to go, and they were thrown. And of course, the other attorney just tore him apart and got up and said, "How do you know any of this is true? By the way, here's collateral evidence that what you're saying that the client told you is not true, and this and that." And the agency ultimately had to let them go because of this, because it was such a big deal and beyond the scope of practice. So, gotta be careful,
Yeah.
and and just, I mean, for parents too, if you find yourself, because even if you're not malicious, you might feel desperate and you want some help, and your therapist is supportive, and just know that if you push them, ultimately it's probably not going to help. That's a good thing to know. Don't put your investment in the practical solutions coming from the emotional professional.
Yeah. So let's circle to my next question. What kind of therapy do you provide in the context of a divorce and child custody case dealing with parental alienation? What are the distinguishing features of the therapy, the specific therapies that you use?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, there is oftentimes something that is being called for. So you always want to know, and if the client doesn't know, you want to make sure they ask either their attorney or you go over the court order together. It might say we want them to get this, right?
Mhm.
And so you want to start from there, obviously. Um, but then the modalities that you might use with someone, I think are very important. I'm come from what they call a trauma informed background, which means that if most therapists are some degree of that nowadays, where we look for evidence or elements of trauma that could be influencing the way that people are acting. It's very important in a divorce. It's traumatic for everybody to some degree. Even amicable divorces can be that way, or the things that led up to it are traumatic. And
Yeah.
that's particularly true for kids because they didn't get a vote, right? I mean, that's important to keep in mind. Nobody usually asks, if you do, it's inappropriate. You shouldn't ask your kid, hey, do you think I should get a divorce? But
Yeah,
and
that's
that would
probably
be
not in the
traumatic.
handbook. Yeah.
Right. And that would be traumatic all by itself. So coming at it from there, I think that so using a lot of modern, oftentimes some of the modern trauma techniques, such as internal family systems or EMDR, or some of those can play a role where we're identifying the emotional processes. I think from a behavioral standpoint, There's obviously the good old cognitive behavioral, and also ties in with that is what they call dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT. It has to do with practicing and learning behaviors that can affect your ability to communicate, to stand up for yourself in a healthy way, to not lash out with people, and to emotionally regulate. There's a lot of crossover, but basically, I think with these kinds of cases, you almost always are going to have some behavioral component that people are going to set a goal, try to practice it. Um, for example, a lot of my clients I've worked with, if they're in the parent role, one of the things that they practice is responding, like making rules for themselves about how they respond to the other parent, or how they respond when a kid comes and says, "Well, the other parent said you suck." Make some rules and guidelines for themselves. Say, "I will never say this." And sometimes I will say as little as possible. Or I have a rehearsed almost response that is like, this is what I say. I might even tell the kid, nope, I don't go there. I'm not going to go there. You tell me what should we do? What should we work on? Or some version of that. It's
Yeah.
individualized, obviously. So those are some of the approaches that you're probably going to look for when you're working with a therapist, that they do that. And I think this gets into a future question a bit, but you do want to make sure they have experience in the area.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, piggybacking off of that, you're a court approved therapist. What does it take to become court approved? You obviously have the qualifications to become a therapist itself. What are the further things you need to do to become court approved?
Hmm. Well, and that's an excellent question, because the first of all is the thing you said, which is someone, baseline is a licensed therapist, right? That they have that education and all that stuff, and that they are legally certified to do therapy, right? Obviously,
Mhm.
that's pretty important.
Yes.
And then building upon that, there's kind of two sides to this. From the therapist perspective, the ethics of what you do, you are licensed to provide therapy. That's a broad umbrella, right?
Yeah.
And so, does someone provide like a specific type of trauma therapy? Well, have they been trained, um, or or certified? And what I mean by certified is, oftentimes certifications in modalities of therapy are controlled by the company that invented the term for
Mm.
that. And so you can go to training after training, and maybe you go through and get certified, or maybe you just go through, like, oh, I've been through a bunch of trainings in an area. So if the court order says they need to be certified as this, they need to be certified as that. If it says you need to get this type of therapy, then you want to talk to them about their experience as well as their training process. That's for the parent, is that's what you want to ask. And that's a little, I mean, it sounds a little funny, but basically, take for example, let me use this one, registered play therapist. Now, there's an association of play therapists, and there's a whole process that you go through to become that. Sexual addiction, same thing. EMDR, same thing. DBT, same thing. Whatever. If you go and you find that I'm looking for people who have been certified in that, and in my direct area or in my whole state, there's 3 of them, then you want to look for people who are experienced with it, who may or may not be fully certified, because maybe it costs, it takes 5 years and costs $10,000, $12,000 overall to get certified in it. And so most didn't. Now, that might sound funny, but this, so people evaluate that. If you're going to ask the certification question and then hang up if they say no, you might want to ask a few follow-up questions. Or no, maybe there's 100 of them in your town. Um, so that's one thing people don't think about if they don't work in the industry. Um, so experience is necessary. One of the things, for example, I belong to the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts, the Utah chapter. That's something that I registered for and joined, and they have lists of therapists and things, and you have to provide a little bit of experience. And so for myself, I've been trained in a lot of the things I mentioned, obviously, and have certifications and trainings over my career. But I also, and I feel like this is even more pertinent, worked in residential youth care. I worked with DCFS for years as a undergraduate, like, mental health worker, as well as a therapist. Worked with the Children's Justice Center. Worked with doing years and years of couples counseling, that kind of thing. Um, and so, asking a little bit about that, and membership in one of these organizations, and also, that also affords trainings and training opportunities and things. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but so you kind of got the two elements. Once again, practically, you want to talk to them and your attorney just to make sure that they are going to meet the whatever the court's asking for. And then you want to ask them and say, "What's your experience? Can you tell me a little bit about why you do this?" Oftentimes we don't do that when we see a counselor in general, but it's always a good idea to ask a few questions. I mean, I'm a big consumer advocate, so.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. That was my last question. So, thank you. Do you want to just give your contact info again? So if, people who are watching this, maybe they want to use you for your services or check out your podcast.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you can kind of the best focal point to get a hold of me and see what I'm doing is my website, which is just dwighthurst.com. My email is actually the best email to send to me is the same, dwighthurst@gmail.com. Um, and so you can go there, and there's a bunch of little, well, obviously links in the website. Not to show off, that's how a website works. But anyway, there's lots of different links and areas with. I try to also include some free resources, as well as there's stuff about the podcast. The podcast is The Broken Brain. That's something that I've been doing since about 2014. And so there's a lot of materials you can find. Obviously, they're just available for free there. Try to do a lot of advocacy and sharing information about charities, nonprofits, and those and also interviews with creative individuals, authors, and filmmakers, as well as clinicians, and just basically looking at the kind of the human experience is what's there. And so that's a good place to check if it's something that you are looking for therapy, or if you just have questions for me, or just whatever it is. Yeah, you can reach me through there